I'm tracking something like the U.S. $6.85 poverty line than, say, the traditional interest rate curve in Latin America?
It's a great question.
Because what this comprehensive 25-year report we've been digging into shows is that social metrics, not just macro policy, might be the ultimate indicator of long-term investment risk.
Exactly. And that's our mission today, isn't it? To really unpack this new report on the socioeconomic path of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah, we want to get beyond the headlines and really understand the fragility of the progress they've made and the big structural challenges that are still threatening stability all over the region.
It's a crucial insight. When we talk about putting capital to work in Latin America, the focus is usually on the hard numbers,
Yeah.
GDP, commodities, debt.
The usual suspect.
Right. But this report, which covers a huge span from 2000 to 2024, it just makes this undeniable case that you can't separate stability from social health. Poverty and inequality are not just humanitarian issues.
No, they're leading indicators. They tell you about political instability, about the future of the consumer base.
That's the whole game right there.
Now, this deep dive is possible thanks to the support of our sponsor, Broker 360 in Argentina. If you're operating in Argentina or even just planning a trip there, managing your risk is absolutely critical.
Couldn't agree more.
And Broker 360 handles insurance policies for all sectors: cars, home, business, really whatever you need. You can find their WhatsApp, website, and email right in the description to contact them easily. So once again, a huge thanks to Broker 360 for supporting this deep dive.
So the central narrative of this whole report is something they call the paradox of progress interrupted.
Right. It's this story of a huge transformative boom, mostly driven by commodities, between about 2003 and 2014.
And then a full decade of stagnation. And now what we're seeing is a recovery that's, well, it's really uneven. And most importantly, it's very, very fragile.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Before we even get to the numbers, we need to understand the tools. Why can't we just use the simple global standard for extreme poverty? The 215 a day line.
And that's exactly where the analysis has to start. Latin America and the Caribbean, or LAC, is fundamentally a middle-income region.
It's not sub-Saharan Africa.
Precisely. That $2.15 line is critical for measuring absolute physical subsistence. But in these highly urbanized, market-driven countries, being just above that line, well, it doesn't guarantee you can actually participate in economic life.
So it's just not a useful metric there. It misses the real story.
It completely misses the kind of material and social exclusion that actually drives discontent.
So if that subsistence line is too low, what's the central metric? What's the reliable number we should be looking at for the whole region?
We have to focus on the $6.85 per day threshold, and that's adjusted for purchasing power parity.
The PPA 217 numbers. Okay.
That is the key measure. If you're below this line, it means your household just doesn't have the resources to cover basic needs and, meaningfully participate in society. It's the analytical foundation for this whole report.
And the way the report puts it, which I think is a great way to picture it, is this income ladder.
Absolutely. It helps to think of it in tiers. At the very, very bottom, you have that extreme poverty line, the 215.
Survival.
Just survival. Then you cross that key 685 line, and you can start to meet basic economic demands. But then you enter this huge group they call the vulnerable.
And that's between $6.85 and $14 a day.
Yes, and it is a massive population living in constant instability. Then finally, you have the established middle class, over $14 a day, who have genuine stability and can actually save.
And a lot of the risk we're talking about lives in that huge, vulnerable group.
That's where it is.
And I'm assuming, since we're comparing, Mexico and Argentina and Chile, we have to use harmonized international data for this, right? Not just local poverty lines.
Oh, absolutely. National lines are all over the place. They define the basic basket of goods differently. They adjust for inflation differently. To get a true regional benchmark, you have to use harmonized data sets, like from ECLAC or the World Bank, to filter out all that noise.
Okay, so let's turn to the overall trend. Using that 685 line, what does the big picture look like for the region?
The trend looks like an asymmetrical L. A really sharp, dramatic reduction in poverty up until about 2014, driven by that commodity supercycle.
And
Then stagnation.
Yeah.
It just flattened out. And then the 2020 pandemic hit, and it was this massive, sudden shock that just wiped out nearly a decade of gains in a single year. Millions were pushed back below the line.
a devastating setback. So after that, what happened in 2023? Did we manage to stabilize things?
We did, and this really is the good news here. The region successfully recovered the ground it lost. The regional poverty rate, using that 685 line, is now at 25%.
And that's a record low.
It's the lowest level recorded in the entire 21st century. So the progress is undeniable, but it was incredibly hard-won, and it came at a very high fiscal cost.
That recovery sounds strong. But what was powering it between 2021 and 2023? Was it mainly governments just, launching massive social programs? Or was the private sector pulling the weight?
The analysis shows the primary engine was the market, the recovery of the labor market. And that means both the number of jobs and, crucially, the recovery of real wages in certain countries. That explained nearly 2/3 of the poverty reduction.
2/3. So job creation was the main story here.
It was, but that raises a critical question about sustainability.
Right. Because if the labor market was the engine, does that mean countries that relied more on fiscal transfers, like maybe Brazil, could see those gains disappear once the stimulus is gone?
That's the risk. Public transfers played a vital but secondary role. They were essential for, preventing the absolute poorest from starving, but the labor market provided the real momentum.
And what was the big headwind?
The major counterforce was food inflation. It acted as a huge brake, just eroding the purchasing power of those families who had just gotten back to work.
So if we connect this all back to an investment strategy, the big takeaway here is divergence.
Structural divergence. It's not like the commodity boom years where, a rising tide lifted almost all the boats at once. The post-2020 recovery is marked by huge performance gaps. Not all countries are in the same boat anymore.
You really have to analyze risk country by country now.
On a granular level, yes.
Okay, so let's dig into that divergence, starting with the biggest outliers, case A, inflation, and institutional risk. Argentina seems to be the undisputed negative outlier. What's the scale of the problem there?
Argentina shows you what happens when macroeconomic stability just completely fails. Its poverty rate went from around 25% in 2011 to an estimated, over 52% in the first half of 2024.
52%? That's staggering.
And the driver is absolute. Chronic inflation, exceeding 200% year over year. The report really highlights this working poor phenomenon.
Millions of people with formal jobs.
Normal jobs. But their salaries just cannot keep up with the cost of a basic basket of goods. And that creates enormous social tension.
And then there's Peru, which for so long was the star of poverty reduction, but now it's hit a wall.
Peru is a different kind of failure, but just as worrying. It had dropped its poverty rate all the way down to 20% by 2019, but it's seen a massive reversal, climbing back up to 29% in 2023.
And that's not inflation, that's
institutional failure. Chronic political instability has just paralyzed private investment, especially in key sectors like mining that used to drive job growth. That paralysis leads directly to social decay.
Okay, so now for case B, the success stories. Let's look at Mexico.
Mexico is a really significant recent success, especially if you look at it through a multidimensional lens. Poverty fell by 5.1 million people between 2018 and 2022.
And the main driver was a total paradigm shift.
Exactly. Historic, real increases to the minimum wage. It rose over 100% in real terms in just 6 years. That, combined with record high remittances, just gave this massive lift to low-income families.
But the report does have a word of caution for Mexico, even with those big income gains.
It does. While income poverty dropped, the report notes that extreme poverty and critically access to public health care actually got worse.
So there's a tension there.
A big tension. Market income's improved, but the social safety net is straining to keep up. That creates a new vulnerability, especially around health.
And Brazil, the other giant, also saw a quick rebound.
A very rapid reduction.
Yeah.
Brazil fell from 27% poverty in 2021 to just 22% in 2023.
What was the recipe there?
A powerful 1-2 punch. The massive expansion of the Bolsa Família social transfer program, plus a surprisingly resilient labor market. Unemployment hit historic lows, around 7 or 8%.
Okay, and finally, there's case C countries like Chile and Uruguay, who've mostly beaten mass poverty, but now face what the report calls the vulnerability challenge.
Right, they have low single-digit poverty rates. But their challenge is completely different now.
Their fight isn't about mass poverty anymore.
Not at all. It's about combating the vulnerability of income. A huge portion of their population is technically middle class, but their stability is, it's delicate.
And you see these strange paradoxes, like in Uruguay.
Uruguay is a fascinating case. You have almost zero poverty among seniors because of a mature pension system. But the report points to the infantilization of poverty, very high poverty rates among children under 6.
Which tells you there's a systemic failure somewhere in early childhood support.
Exactly. It shows you where the future risks are hiding, even in the most stable economies in the region.
We've seen just how uneven this recovery is, driven by labor markets, but really threatened by inflation and paralysis in some key countries. When we get back, we're going to shift from absolute poverty to that deeper, more stubborn challenge that really defines Latin America, the concentration of income at the very top. If you're enjoying what you're hearing today, we'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and please let us know in the comments what topics you'd like us to cover in future deep dives. In the description, you'll also find two important links. One to our sponsor, Broker360, and another to PayPal if you'd like to support this project. Your contribution, even just the price of a coffee, helps us keep making content like this. Thank you so much for your support. Welcome back. So we've established that there have been some great strides in reducing poverty across the region, which is, good news for consumer markets. But the underlying issue that creates so much social and political volatility is the income gap. The question is, what does the report tell us about inequality?
This is what I call the stagnant ceiling, and it is the key structural definition of risk in Latin America. The region is still the most unequal on the entire planet, and the measure we use for that is the Gini coefficient.
Okay, before we get into the trends, maybe a quick refresher on the Gini Index for everyone listening.
Of course. The Gini Index is just a standard way to measure how income or wealth is distributed in a country. It runs from 0 to 1.
0 being perfect equality.
Right. Everyone has the same income. And a score of 1 is perfect inequality, where one person has everything. And the big regional story here is that the trend of inequality reduction just stalled. It basically stopped after 2015.
So the growth we saw in the mid-2000s, it lifted the absolute bottom, which reduced poverty.
Yeah.
But the actual gap between the very rich and everyone else, that didn't really narrow much after the commodity boom was over.
That is the core problem. And the numbers are just startling. You have to go beyond the overall Gini score to see the concentration. The report says the top 10%, the wealthiest, capture an average of 34% of all national income.
34%.
And top economists, like Nora Lustig, warn that's probably an underestimate. When you factor in the underreporting of capital gains by the super rich, that capture can easily go over 40, maybe even 50% in places like Brazil and Chile.
It creates a structural divergence that the regional averages just hide.
Completely, which is what makes Mexico's performance on the Gini so remarkable.
Right. It's the big exception to that stagnation.
It's the single biggest one. Mexico saw its Gini drop by a significant 5.5 points, from 0.486 to 0.431 in a really short time. And this was driven almost entirely by what we talked about before.
The compression from below.
That's it. Historic minimum wage growth just dwarfed the salary growth for medium and high earners, which effectively closed the gap from the bottom up.
And the sharpest contrast to that, showing how fast inequality can come roaring back, is Argentina.
It's the perfect contrast. While Mexico was compressing the Gini, Argentina saw a dramatic deterioration. The index actually increased by 3.8 points.
Yeah.
It's just this powerful illustration of how runaway inflation acts as a fundamentally regressive tax.
It just punishes the poor and anyone on a fixed income.
And it widens the wealth gap faster than almost anything else.
So we've established the progress is real, but it's fragile, and the region is deeply, deeply unequal. Let's look at the three big long-term structural risks that keep these economies so volatile and so risky for long-term investment.
Okay, the first and the absolute largest risk is the sheer size of the vulnerability trap. This is the biggest group to worry about for stability.
31.5% of the entire population.
31.5%. They've escaped poverty, but they are not yet true middle class. They are a huge pool of consumers and workers who are one single shock away.
A sickness, a job loss.
A climate disaster, anything, and they fall right back into poverty. The system offers zero security guarantees for this massive group.
So the system fails to turn low-income workers into resilient, stable consumers, which leads right into the second major roadblock, the informal ceiling.
Exactly. Labor informality averages a staggering 50% across the region, and it can climb as high as 70 or 80% in places like Peru or Central America.
50%! That's a glass ceiling for both equality and productivity.
It is. Informal workers have no social security, no pensions. They were the first to lose their income in 2020 and had absolutely no safety net. You cannot build a resilient consumer base or a modern productive economy on that foundation.
And finally, we have those new threats that are directly impacting business, climate volatility and just rapidly escalating security crises.
And these new threats just amplify that vulnerability trap. Security crises, especially the surge in organized crime in Ecuador, Haiti, Central America, that acts like a direct regressive tax on small businesses. Extortion and crime destroy small-scale assets, and they actively discourage local investment, which is a huge brake on job growth. And at the same time, for the smaller economies in Central America and the Caribbean, hurricanes and droughts are now direct, recurring drivers of poverty and forced migration. They just destabilize entire supply chains.
This all raises a huge strategic question for the region. What do the experts say is needed to get Latin America out of this chronic low-growth trap? I mean, growth is hovering at what, 1 to 2%?
That's right. And the consensus is a structural warning. Relying on commodity exports and social transfers has hit its limit.
There's nowhere else to go with that model.
Exactly. As William Maloney argues, without a real return to 4 or 5% sustainable growth, any redistribution effort just hits a fiscal and political wall. You can't share wealth fast enough to pull 31% of your people out of the vulnerability trap if the whole pie isn't growing.
The growth wall.
So the economic engine has to be transformed, not just tweaked.
And that's the core reform argument.
It is. Jose Manuel Salazar Zirinax points out that the recent poverty reduction is ephemeral, it's short-lived, if it isn't backed by a permanent change in the productive structure. The focus has to pivot to generating better quality jobs through industrialization and modern high-value services.
If there's one major opportunity to break that cycle, what does the report identify?
Eric Parado highlights what he calls the green opportunity. The global transition to clean energy and the demand for critical minerals, which countries like Chile, Peru, Paraguay have in abundance. That's cited as the single biggest investment opportunity right now to generate high-quality, formal jobs and break away from those old commodity cycles.
Okay, so considering this whole menu of risks and opportunities, the report outlines 3 potential paths for 2025 to 2030. They're basically long-term macro bets for an investor.
The first is the optimistic scenario, the productive leap. Nearshoring and the green transition actually succeed in attracting quality investment, especially to places like Mexico or Costa Rica. Poverty falls below 20%, the middle class really expands.
And the baseline expectation, the most likely path.
The base scenario is basically inertia. Mediocre, low growth, around 2%. Governments use targeted transfers to manage discontent, but they avoid the hard structural issues like health and education. Inequality just stagnates. The vulnerability trap stays stubbornly large.
And the downside, the risk investors have to plan for.
That's the adverse scenario. What many are afraid could be a lost decade 2.0. An external shock hits these economies that have no fiscal room to maneuver. Crime rises, the cost of doing business skyrockets, and poverty rebounds sharply, maybe back up to 30%, erasing all the gains of the last decade.
The conclusion is pretty stark. Latin America has the tools to reduce mass poverty. We saw that in the 2023 rebound. But the model has been, as the report says, income-intensive, relying on transfers and commodities, and service-poor, failing to deliver quality education and healthcare.
And reducing poverty without tackling that underlying inequality of opportunity just creates these incredibly volatile societies that will always be a threat to capital.
Volatility is the price of that fragility. The report seems to suggest that for stability to be real, institutions have to be blinded or made independent so that core social and fiscal policies can actually survive a change in government.
And that is the ultimate measure of sovereign risk, isn't it? If a country's entire economic and social path depends completely on who wins the next election.
Then the stability is just an illusion.
Exactly. So when you're evaluating a country's market potential, its macro risk for a long-term investment, ask yourself this one provocative question. Are its fundamental policies, its minimum wage, its pension system, its tax collection, are they designed to outlast the next election cycle?
That commitment to durable, independent policy, that's the measure of real resilience.
That's everything.
And with that sobering thought, we come to the end of today's deep dive. We really hope you liked it, that you learned something new, and that you'll join us for the next one.
Remember that in the description, you will find the links to our sponsor, Broker360, and to PayPal in case you want to help us out. Thank you once again for listening.